the way we see it today. It was a loose assemblage. Many of the texts were redundant. Some of them were poorly written. And very few people were able to access this material. And Constantine, in an effort to make it more accessible to a broad general audience, pulled together a council within the church and said, "Council, make me some recommendations. What should we leave in? What should we take out? How should we arrange this material?" And the result of that was what we call today our Western biblical text, biblical tradition. We know that at least 20 books were completely removed, and another 20 to 25 were tremendously edited, and the remaining texts were condensed and rearranged into what we see today as our biblical text. So as good as our Bible is today, the best biblical scholars will openly and freely admit that it is incomplete. And we know this because we're finding these documents in places like the Dead Sea Scrolls Library. This is why they were so controversial. When we found the Dead Sea Scrolls for the first time, we were able to see many of these books in their original form. Some of them hadn't been seen for 1,700 years. And interestingly, many of the books that were edited or taken out completely are precisely the documents that describe our relationship to the universe and the creation around us through the power of human emotion. So now that science is beginning to tell us in its language, ancient spiritual traditions have shown us in their way, and in our own texts and documents, we're seeing references to precisely how these principles work. The question is, how do we apply them in our lives? How do we go about making use of this relationship between thoughts, feelings, and emotions inside of our bodies and what's happening in the world around us? Well, perhaps the best place to begin is by defining what a thought and a feeling and emotion really are. I've had this conversation with my mom many, many times. And Mom always says to me, she goes, "I always thought feelings and emotions were the same thing." And while they're closely related, there is a difference. So if we think of a chart, if you look at the ancient charts of the energy centers in our bodies, the chakra centers, if you will, what we see is the lower three energy centers of our bodies. They are closely associated with what we call the power of human emotion. And the ancients said we're capable of only two primary emotions. They said we're capable of the emotion of love, and whatever we believe the opposite of love really is. Whether we think of that as fear or hate. And when you get really deep into the traditions, what we find is they are actually both polarities of the same force. So in those lower centers, the power of emotion, we have two primary experiences, love and whatever we believe the opposite of love really is. This is a power. It's a force that drives us forward in life, and it tears down the walls, knocks down the barriers that stand between us and the things that we hold dear in our lives. Emotion, however, is scattered. It has to be focused. You can think of it as a power. If you know people who live strictly in their emotions, you know that sometimes their lives can be a little chaotic. Well, the emotions need to be focused, and this is where the power of thought or logic come in, and it's associated with the upper energy centers of the body. Thought is what gives focus or direction to the emotions. In other words, we have a thought about something. We have a thought about a cloudy day outside. And that thought, into that thought, we fuel the power of the emotion, either our love of that rainy day or our fear of what that rainy day may bring to us. And by doing so, when we marry the power of emotion with the direction of the thought, by virtue of that, we create a feeling. So feeling, by definition, is the union of emotion and the thought. And the one energy center, interestingly enough, that is not accounted for in all the other systems, that remains unused in these ancient systems, is the heart center. And this is the one that is dedicated to the power of feeling. We feel in our hearts. So the feeling that we have in our hearts is the language that speaks to the field that Western science is now beginning to understand through their experiments. It's the power of human feeling that is the language that opens the door to the possibilities of what we create in our world. Well, scientists today, as they think about this field, it is so new, the idea is so new, that they've yet to agree even on a single term. Some scientists call this the quantum hologram. Some call it nature's mind. Dr. Ed Mitchell former Apollo astronaut, calls this nature's mind. Scientists like Stephen Hawking call it the mind of God. As varied as the names appear to be, they're all speaking about essentially the same field, and they describe this field as a web or a net that underlies the fabric that links everything together. And it is this fabric, this web, this net, is what we speak to with the feelings in our bodies, with the feelings in our hearts. Ancient traditions not only recognized this relationship, they invite us one step further, and they left precise instructions in terms of how we apply this in our lives. In the late 1980s, I was an engineer working in the defense and aerospace corporations. I began exploring these concepts as an engineer, looking in the world around me to understand the history of those who have come before us. And it is that thinking that led me into the journeys of some of the most amazing places in the world, from the temples in Egypt, the Andes Mountains in Bolivia and Peru, into India and Nepal, the highlands of central China and Tibet, all through the American desert Southwest, searching for information and clues that would help us to understand how we relate to the world and how we can use this power of feeling, this power that speaks the language, the world around us. So as an engineer, when I began studying the principles of those who have come before us, the information that they left so that we could understand our relationship to the world around us and this ancient technology that today we call prayer, my thinking was that this kind of information would be best preserved in places that have been least disturbed by Western civilization. And this thinking led me into a journey, first time in 1998, into the highlands of central China, into Tibet, where we had the opportunity to explore 12 monasteries and 2 nunneries, speaking through the translators to those who actually live these principles in their lives. And this is the value of going to a place like Tibet, a living culture. We can go into temples in Egypt or temples, the Mayan temples in the Yucatan, and as fascinating as they are and as much information as they hold, the cultures that left that kind of information no longer exist. So at very best, we are speculating in terms of what they're saying to us. When we go into a monastery in Tibet, we can actually speak with the people who are there, and we can ask them, when we see your prayers on the outside, what are you doing on the inside? What happens? What happens to your body? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you emoting? Well, it was in Tibet where I had the opportunity to meet with an abbot of one of the monasteries, and I asked him through the translator. Same thing we'd asked all of the monks and all of the nuns, and it was his answer that was so clear to me. And I asked him, when we see your prayers for 12 and 14 and 16 hours a day, when we see the mudras and the mantras and the bells and the bowls and the gongs and the chimes and the chants that you're doing in your prayers for so long on the outside, I said, what are you doing on the inside? What happens on the inside? And the abbot looked at me, and I like to think he was laughing with me, or he may have been laughing at me, because he said through the translator again, he said, you've never seen our prayers, because a prayer cannot be seen. He said, what you have seen are the things that we do to create the feeling in our bodies. And the feeling is the prayer. Then he turned the question on me, and he said, how do you do it in your culture? How do you do this in your culture? And I began to think about the way we think about prayer in our culture today. When we lost the texts that describe how the power of emotion and feeling are actually the language that connect us with the universe and the creation around us, we began to believe that words are simply the prayers. If we say the right words, the right number of times, the right day of the year, the right time of day, that we've said the prayer. And as well-intentioned as those prayers may be, what we know is that there is a modality of prayer that carries us far beyond where simply offering the words will carry us. Western prayer researchers today identify 4 modalities of prayer. They say when we pray in the West, we use one or some combination of these 4 modes of prayer. The first is an informal prayer that's called a colloquial prayer. I had a friend of mine that lived in the Bay Area in San Francisco that would say this informal prayer coming home from work every Friday on the interstate. Dear God, if you let me get to the Conoco station,